Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar series. Tonight's topic is this the end of compounding? We're just having people still logging on, so we're gonna wait about 2 more minutes before we get going. So thanks for hanging in there, but a couple more minutes and we'll get rolling.
So they can hear us on Facebook, so that's good news. On the bottom, there's 16 people online on Zoom and 29 on Facebook. So if they have questions, ask for them, type them in the Q&A.
Oh yeah, use the.
Will you do the? You're going to do the intro.
7:03. Shall we roll?
Sure.
Okay. Yep. All right. Good evening, everyone. This is Dean Miller here. I'm the president of Whole Health Pharmacy Partners, and with me tonight, James Morrison. And welcome to our ongoing webinar series. Tonight's topic again is this the end of compounding? So we have 2 methods to watch us tonight. One is via Zoom, and the second one is on Facebook. So we've got pretty good crowd on both right now. So we're going to get rolling shortly. James has done a lot of research on this topic. We're not going to claim to know all of the answers here tonight because this is still a very, very confusing topic. But I think at the end of it, you know, if you can walk away with, you know, answering the question, can I still compound? Because we've heard a lot from people who kind of go, you know, I don't even think I can do this anymore. And then also, you know, maybe even better, should I do it? So, you know, a lot of questions around compounding. We're sort of in a very interesting time right now. So we're sort of in a transition phase where we are starting to kind of get ready for the NAPRA standards change, but and hence why we're doing the webinar tonight. So I'm going to hand it over to James at this time. I'm going to monitor questions. So we'll start off by saying, you know, if you have any questions, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I'll try and at least give you a response, and for those questions that seem pertinent to the presentation, we'll hand them over to James and let him try and answer it as best as possible. So with that, thanks again everybody for tuning in, and James, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, Dean. Thank you for that intro. So as you said, tonight we're going to be addressing the non-sterile compounding regulations. So the agenda we're going to go through tonight is we're going to start with the timeline leading up to the approval of the NAPRA standards, and then we're going to go through the timeline as well for the phases and some of the requirements that pharmacists and pharmacy owners need to be aware of in order to make compounding a continued reality in pharmacy, and then address some resources that we can all use in our pharmacies. So beginning with the timeline. So there were some historical devastating events that did happen leading up to adopting the NAPRA standards here across most of Canada. So actually the first one there in 2012, that is from the United States. There was a New England compounding pharmacy produced contaminated steroid injections, which resulted in fungal meningitis infections across a wide region of the US and resulted in 64 deaths. The next year here in Ontario, we had a chemotherapy underdosing event where a particular compounding pharmacy was supplying hospitals with diluted chemotherapy, and a number of patients received that here in Ontario and New Brunswick. The third one there in the timeline relates to a young boy from Mississauga, Andrew Sheldrick. He received a compounding pharmacy prescription that was supposed to be a medication to help him sleep, tryptophan, but instead received a lethal dose of baclofen, and unfortunately he passed away. And then subsequent to that, in 2017 here in Alberta, or 2017 here in Ontario rather, and 2018 in Alberta, the standards were adopted for all pharmacies for any kind of non-sterile compounding, any quantity, whether once in a while or every day. So it affects every single pharmacy that is compounding. And here's a picture of Andrew Sheldrick, the young boy who passed away from the compounding error. And that also led to the assurance and improvement in medication safety program here in Ontario, with the aim of improving safety for all patients as they interface with medications. And of note, Andrew's initials AS are part of the acronym for that program. So when we look at the implementation timeline, Ontario and Alberta, there's 3 phases. The first phase is assessing gaps. The second phase relates to personnel training and quality assurance. And the third phase relates to facilities and equipment. And we'll be having a brief overview of all 3 of these phases here tonight. Ontario is presently leading up to phase 2 in the implementation timeline, and Alberta is a bit further along. They're getting closer to phase 3. I wanted to start with a conversation about compounding versus manufacturing and what is batching as well, and can you do it? So compounding happens between a healthcare professional, a pharmacist, and their patients. So those are orders relating to particular patients. The other end of the spectrum is bulk quantities that are produced in advance without knowing the intended patient at the time. So that here in Ontario typically is done by, there's drug preparation premises that prepare batches of medications in large quantities to supply to hospitals. But I often get the question, can a pharmacy prepare batches in their own pharmacy for their own patients? And the answer is you can prepare some limited quantities in anticipation of prescriptions if you have the data to back up that you are expecting that need. So if you know you have 5 patients routinely getting that prescription and you fill it regularly every month, well, you could prepare a limited quantity in advance based on that information. So a big question when you get that compound at the pharmacy is whether should you be accepting that and compounding it or not. And the first question you need to ask yourself, whether to compound or not, is that medication already available commercially in those strengths? So a good example is fusidin H. So you would not compound 1% hydrocortisone into fusidin because that is already available on the market. Other important questions to ask: do you have a reference formulation? Do you have the recipe to make that compound? Do you know what would be the beyond use date? Because we're required now to assign that to every mixture when we provide it to the patient. Do you have in your pharmacy the dedicated space for compounding? Do you have the appropriate equipment and ingredients? So if that compound requires certain safety equipment, do you have that available? And do you have the trained personnel to make that formulation? And lastly, can you prepare that with uninterrupted compounding workflow? So if it's the middle of the day and you're there by yourself and you're handling the regular dispensing workflow, well, that's not the time where you want to step away and make a compound, knowing that you might likely be interrupted. So the hard question is, should I be accepting that compound, or unfortunately, does that business need to be referred to someone who has the expertise and the equipment and facilities to make it? And we're going to be dealing with some of those questions, helping you check those boxes later in the presentation. Jumping right into phase 1. So in both Ontario and Alberta, we are actually beyond phase 1. So we ought to have completed these steps already. If you haven't, well, I'm giving you some advice on how you might do that. And also, if you've already done this for all the compounds you have now, well, if you get a new compound tomorrow, you have to do the risk assessment for that one as well. So hopefully this will be relevant to you in your practice. The first thing to do when getting into phase 1 is make sure you know who is a designated non-sterile compounding supervisor in the pharmacy. It has to be a regulated person, so it could be a pharmacist or a technician with training in compounding. In many cases, the designated manager is also the non-sterile compounding supervisor. There are responsibilities with this role, which includes overseeing all aspects of the non-sterile compounding, being an expert in the NAPRA standards for non-sterile compounding, ensuring that a risk assessment is completed for every single compound, so you don't have to necessarily be the one completing the assessment, but you have to ensure that it's being done. You are ultimately responsible for facilities and equipment that are appropriate and maintained, that beyond use dates are available for every compound, and also the master formulas.
James, a question on designate supervisor. This role doesn't take on anything, I guess, in addition to just a supervisory role over the compounding process, right? So from a regulatory perspective, this person doesn't have any greater degree of scrutiny on them. Am I correct in saying that? From a, let's say, from a college perspective, right? For when you're looking at sort of the accuracy and integrity of a compound.
That's a really good question. So it's designated compounding supervisor isn't like a legislated title like a designated manager of a pharmacy. But I would think we're going to see, and you and I both sit on complaints next week, in fact, but you would, as you know, if an error happens in a pharmacy, there's often shared responsibility. So I would think that there will be added level of responsibility and liability
right
upon this individual.
So if you assign this to a technician, for instance, probably that person should be informed of potentially the added degree of like I used the word scrutiny before on this role.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it is an added responsibility in any role, whether in any pharmacy, whether it's a technician or a pharmacist that has the training and the skills to be this, to take on this role. But yeah, it does come with that extra burden. I think I can answer that question right now. So okay, we do have a question.
All right, so I'll read it out. Thanks, Samar, for the question. Is a written risk assessment necessary for every compound, even simple ones, hydrocortisone and menthol and Glaxo base, etc.?
The answer is yes, unfortunately. Even the most simple compounds, every single compound requires a documented risk assessment. I think you'll get very good at them, Samar, so don't worry. Once you've done a few, it will get easier. And lastly, quality assurance falls under the responsibility of the designated supervisor for compounding. So I tried to come up with some steps to help guide pharmacists and technicians through completing the risk assessment. And I'm going to walk you through each and show you examples. So a first step is you look at what is your active pharmaceutical ingredient, and then you go and check, is that ingredient listed with National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, on their list of hazardous drugs. And there's 3 sections to that list, which I'll detail for you in a moment. Secondly, you review the safety data sheet. Safety data sheets are available from chemical suppliers. So, for example, Mediska has them all posted on their website, open access for all of their chemicals. So you don't need a subscription to get the SDS sheet. On that sheet, it's basically what we used to call a WMIS sheet. So it gives you the health hazards, reproductive risk, if that compound requires ventilation, and any personal protective equipment that ought to be worn by the compounder or someone handling the product. We're going to discuss how to determine frequency and quantity and how that one is causing some trouble for pharmacists because it's not as clear. Then we're going to talk about assessing complexity. We need to document the risk assessment for every single compound, and we're doing this risk assessment to mitigate risk to the product, but also to the people working in the pharmacy. So NIOSH has 3 sections to it, group 1, 2, and 3. So the first one is anti-neoplastic drugs, so that's cytotoxic chemicals. The group 2 is hazardous chemicals, but are not from the anti-neoplastic group. And the third group is chemicals that pose a reproductive risk. So those in stores in the banner, I'll be sending out a PDF of the slides where you'll be able to click the hyperlink there on the bottom to take you directly to the list. So if you click that link on the bottom, NIOSH list, it will take you directly to the PDF file. So you'll be able to assess, for example, anastrozole. If you had a compound for that, it's part of NIOSH Group 1. And the groups are important because they're part of our risk assessment in determining the level of safety precautions we need to take while preparing the mixture. So examples of level 2, for example, azathioprine, it is a hazardous medication, but not part of the anti-neoplastic group. And level 3 from NIOSH group 3. So an example there would be clonazepam that might have a reproductive risk, but is not part of the other 2 groups. Step 2 that I suggest is you look at the safety data sheet. So this is the safety data sheet for baclofen, and if you want to look at the SDS, there's the hyperlink on the bottom. So you see how it lists on the first page hazard statements and the pictograms. If you've done WMIS training before, this is all familiar. But it lists, for example, sensitization, and then perhaps toxic to reproduction. All of this needs to be considered when we're working through the algorithm later on. And then I cropped out the personal protective equipment. So every SDS will give recommendations about the personal protective equipment that ought to be worn when handling that chemical. So for example, in this case, they recommend gloves and protective eyewear or chemical glasses, protective clothing to avoid contact with skin. Step 3 is where it gets a little bit more difficult for pharmacists because we have to apply our judgment and determine what does small quantity mean and what does frequency, frequent or often or uncommonly compounded really mean. And in these cases, there is no definition in the NAPRA guidelines. Pharmacists will be called upon to use their professional judgment and make a decision. So if your pharmacy once a day, if you consider that infrequent, or if you consider once a week infrequent, it's up to you to decide what that means in your business. Document your decision and any references you use to support your decision. Keep your rationale on record for your risk assessment and to support your decision. And step 4 relates to complexity. So when I show you the algorithm for the risk assessment coming up, you'll see that there's questions there whether the compound is simple, moderate, or complex. Well, a simple compound is a compound that has a USP published formula with known stability. So basically, you have a recipe to follow step by step. There's no question. A compound of moderate complexity is one that requires a little bit more calculation, or one where you have to determine what beyond use state you're going to assign because there's no stability data published for that mixture. And then a complex compound is a more advanced mixture. For example, a modified release dosage form like a transdermal patch, or something that requires an added level of calculation and calibration, like you're making, for example, suppositories of a particular dose, and you had to apply additional calculations. So that would be more of a complex mixture. The level, like the risk assessment, is more influenced by those previous slides, the earlier steps where we looked at NIOSH lists and safety data sheets, compared to the complexity. Complexity is further down in the assessment. So this beast of a decision algorithm.
So James, we have a couple of questions. So before we get to that mess on that slide, how about we do a couple questions, because they're good questions. First one, regarding master formulas, are there specific references the college accepts, or would any of them suffice? So we know about PCCA, we know about Medisca. Question is specifically around Sick Kids Hospital here in Toronto. They have a number of simple compounds on their website. So would that be good enough?
That's an excellent question. And I think that that might remain to be seen. So there's a number of published formulas out there, and Dean, you mentioned a couple good sources. Later in the slides, I'm going to show you some open access ones. And these websites are starting to list caveats on their formulas. If you choose to use these, it is up to you to also determine if they're appropriate recipes. Basically, the liability would still fall to the compounder, the one making that mixture.
So if they felt it was a sound formula, then you know what, as long as you document, you're good.
Yeah, so you need to apply your judgment and make sure you agree with that recipe, double check the calculations, and go ahead with it.
So the next one, I'm going to put you on the spot with this one, because this is quite operational in nature. It's a good question. Because we talked about the designated supervisor and that role. If that person's off for the day, they're not on duty, can the pharmacy staff still accept that prescription for compounding, even though that designated survivor
Yes.
designated supervisor is not there? Sorry.
Yeah, I would equate it to the DM being out of the business. So the compounding supervisor would be responsible for all of the operational policies, procedures in place with regard to compounding. I mean, the DM also would be responsible for that, but they would want to make sure the compounding pharmacy is set up for success. Should they be out of the business for a day, operations may continue and compounds can be received. We're going to talk about later about quality assurance. Part of the role that the compounding supervisor must regularly check in to make sure policies are being followed and compounding practices are being followed. So yes, you can compound even if the supervisor is out of the business for the day or the week.
So when you're in there, you actually are the designated survivor.
Yeah.
So, all right, onwards.
Okay, great. So I am going to walk you through this later with an example, but we created those 4 steps to prepare you to address this algorithm. So you'll have all your information queued up before you look at this spider web of information. But you start at the top there. So asking if the compound is on that NIOSH group 1, so that's the cytotoxic drugs. In most cases, if it is, you end up in level C compounding, which requires a separate compounding room under negative pressure. If it is not from NIOSH group 1, then you say no, and you end up on that box there on the left at the top. And it asks you, is that compound under table 2 or 3 of NIOSH, or is it subject to the Hazardous Products Act? And you get that information from a safety data sheet. And as I mentioned, safety data sheets are available from your chemical suppliers. For example, Mediska has them on their website, open access. So you would look up your API, baclofen, for example, and then you would see if there's any health hazards listed. And we saw in a few slides back, yes, there was. So then the next question, moving to the right, you say yes. Following through, does it require, so is it a reproductive risk to the compounder, that second question, or does it require ventilation? That information is found on the SDS sheet. So we say yes, and then you come to that ambiguous question that's challenging a lot of us. Is it a small quantity? Well, you need to decide for yourself, is making a 30-gram small quantity or 100-gram of compound a small quantity, or is 1 kilogram a small quantity? I would say it's not, but the threshold is up to each pharmacy to determine. So say if we say yes, it's a small quantity, you need to ask yourself, do these ingredients require greater precautions to protect the patient or the compounding staff? So in that stage, you need to ask yourself, do I have personal protective equipment here that's going to protect my staff, or do I have equipment like balances that protect us from powders, or even do I have a containment device, a hood, that would allow greater protection? So if you determine with your assessment that you have, gloves and gowns and caps and masks and goggles and all these great things to protect your staff, then you move to the left. You say, no, I don't need the additional requirements of level B. Is the compound simple, moderate, or complex? So in that stage, if you've laid out that it's simple and moderate, which a lot of compounds fall into that category, then you end up level A compounding. So level A is a designated area in the pharmacy separate from the regular workflow. So you have a separate area specific for compounding where there's enough room for the equipment and the employee, technician or assistant or pharmacist compounding, that they have enough room to work safely and uninterrupted. A level B, I found a lot of confusion around what does level B mean. So there's a couple options under level B compounding facilities. So you can either have a separate room closed off that is well ventilated, and you can have in there a hood or not, or you can have a separate room that's not entirely closed off with a containment device, a hood. So you have a couple options for level B, and it's important that you start completing your risk assessments. I mean, they're supposed to be done, but it's very important if a bulk of your business is level B compounds, you might be facing a renovation to build out a small compounding room, and potentially, depending on what you're interested in, investing in a containment device, a hood, or ensuring you have proper air circulation in that room.
So James, it appears from this slide, and we'll move on shortly, but the biggest difference is really between A and B, because A can easily be accommodated in probably your pharmacy today, whereas B probably is going to require, I mean, if you don't have it now, you're going to require some degree of renovation on your site.
Exactly. So if you didn't have that compounding room now, you really have to start looking at it, because the deadline is coming up the beginning of 2021 if you're in Ontario, and even sooner if you're in Alberta, to start, budgeting for that renovation, sourcing materials, and we can help with that here at Whole Health. So yeah, exactly what Dean said, level A, the majority of pharmacies out there, if they implement some of these precautions, can do level A, and it doesn't necessarily require renovation if you've got the space to that you can designate already in your pharmacy for that process. And do you have a comment?
No.
So this table here, it basically does an overview of those levels. How do we get there without looking at a brutal algorithm? So level A in summary is those simple and moderate compounds without those higher risk chemicals. Level B, you can do some complex compounds, occasional small quantities that require ventilation. And then level C is those chemicals that pose the greatest health risks to your staff, require level C, and that's a separate closed off negative pressure room, which would be a large investment on behalf of the pharmacy to set that up. So really, I asked a very simple question to a number of experts, and we're going to get there in a moment, but can I make this compound in a pharmacy? And every expert I asked gave me a different answer. And I sought out advice from the college here in Ontario, as well as really digging into the NAPRA guidelines. And there's some language there that really supported my assessments, and that is many non-sterile preparations can be compounded in level A requirements. And this may include simple or moderate preparations, and they can contain some hazardous drugs in NIOSH group 2 or 3, or those drugs with health hazards listed in their SDS sheets if there's little or no risk to the personnel, and you can mitigate that with personal protective equipment and your layout and design, and they're being compounded in occasional small quantities to limit exposure. So it's a very important concept, because there's been a lot of even misinformation out there, and also misconceptions with regard to that. So I'm going to take us through an example here. Can I make this compound? It's something you've probably seen before in the pharmacy. So the compound is, can I add hydrocortisone into clotrimidine? So I'm going to take you through those steps that I set out a little while ago. So step 1 is check NIOSH. Well, hydrocortisone powder is not listed under NIOSH at all. So we can add that to our list here, not listed. Review the SDS. So we're looking for health hazards on the safety data sheet, which again is available from your chemical suppliers like Mediska. It does list some fertility concerns, sensitization, eye irritation. So there are some health hazards there. And later in the SDS sheet, it does list out personal protective equipment that pharmacy employees can implement in order to protect themselves while handling this product. So we talked about determining frequency and quantity and how that's subjective. So you need to do your own assessment, what that means in your own pharmacy. So in my example, I'm saying it's a small quantity say we're making 60 grams once a week or so, and assessing the complexity, well, it would probably land in moderate. So I'm saying simple to moderate, and that's because there's no published stability data for that compound. So if I'm going to tackle this algorithm, so I'm with those four steps I went through, we already know it's not under NIOSH. So we go to the left. Yes, there were some health hazards listed there. It's a potential sensitizer, maybe a reproductive risk. So that takes us across because there is a potential reproductive risk. I deemed an occasional small quantity in my assessment. Do they require greater precautions to protect the personnel or the patient? I'm saying in my pharmacy, I'm implementing personal protective equipment. So we're going to make sure we have proper goggles, a mask, the gloves, the gown required. For level A compounding, it doesn't necessarily have to be the disposable gowns. It can be a designated compounding lab coat that's kept in the compounding area and is laundered when it gets dirty, but you could also use disposable gowns. So I'm saying, do they require greater precautions? No. And is the compound simple, moderate, or complex? I decided it was simple, moderate, which takes me to level A. So to answer my question, can I make this compound? Or maybe a better question would have been, what level of requirements are needed for that compound? Well, my answer is, according to my assessment, it can be done under level A if occasional small quantities and precautions are in place. So I'd encourage you all to walk through that assessment and see where you arrive in your own pharmacy. As I said, there are some subjective elements in there, and it all comes down to your own assessment and your own pharmacy in deciding what level of requirements you need to make the compounds.
James, before we get on to this, let's just do a question. So this one's going to test our OCP regulatory ability a little bit. So thanks for this question. It's the pharmacy is contracted with you to make their compound. So it's kind of a central fill compounding scenario. Who is responsible for the final check? Can they label it with the pharmacy label? So you want to tackle that one first, or you want me to do it?
Maybe we'll try this.
It's kind of
jointly.
the answer for really for every prescription, really.
Yeah. So with central fill agreements, which is something we're going to be dabbling in here, I hope, soon with Whole Health to support our banner and our compounding pharmacies, the liability of that mixture falls to the people that make it. So you'd have to have clear set out agreements about who's responsible for what. So say if I am sourcing my compound from Whole Health TMC Pharmacy in London, they would be responsible for making the product and what they put into that product. But I would be responsible in my pharmacy for making sure that that product is therapeutically appropriate for my patient. And when I dispense it out to them, that's my responsibility. But the responsibility for the actual quality of that product lies with the compounding pharmacy that made it. There was a second part of that question, right? Can they label it with their pharmacy label?
Well, I think what you're saying here, James, there's two parts, right? There's the therapeutic appropriateness of the product still sits, as it always does, with the dispensing pharmacy, but certainly the prep work, the actual accuracy of the ingredients still, sits with the people that prepped it, right? So the pharmacy labeling portion of it certainly sits with the dispensing pharmacy.
Yeah. So we're going to transition into phase 2, which is where we're all at here in Ontario now. And it is one of the time-consuming phases. So overview of this section, and please be aware that this is an overview and it doesn't cover all of phase 2. We don't have enough time for that, but I'm going to touch on 5 themes of phase 2 that I found to be important. So they relate to the training and assessment of the staff, providing and implementing policies and procedures related to non-sterile compounding, developing your master formulations for every single compound that you do, how do you determine a beyond use state and assigning those to all of your mixtures, and quality assurance program at the pharmacy. So there is a template available from NAPRA, and I hyperlinked it there on the bottom, so that will be available to our stores. The compounding supervisor is responsible for the training of all of the staff involved in compounding. So you're responsible to ensure that anyone participating is competent. If I was in that role, I would personally want to go and seek out a compounding course so that I would have the competency myself in order to instill that talent to my team and also be able to assess their abilities. So there's quite a broad checklist there that you can go through, and that's just the first page of it when you're assessing pharmacists, technicians, and non-regulated staff involved in the process. And it's not just a one-off event, assessing and training, so you have to monitor ongoing and document your annual assessments of your staff. And don't forget, if you have separate cleaning staff in the pharmacy, they also require some training, which is set out in the NAPRA standards guidance document. So something to be sure you have to read all of that, because this is just an overview. Policies and procedures is a large task. So you'll want to get started on that as soon as you can. There is a list under the NAPRA guidance document, section 5.3.1, where they list out examples of policies and procedures that you should consider for your pharmacy. And it includes basically any activity in compounding ought to have policies and procedures that are followed, and they need to be reviewed regularly at intervals at least every 3 years. If there's been a change in your practice, they have to be updated at that moment. And if you are doing some of those level B or C, there's additional requirements for hazardous chemicals in terms of receipts and storage, handling, labeling, etc. So it is a bit of work. There are SOPs available from compounding vendors. So for example, Mediska does offer compounding SOPs to support pharmacies. And those actually do come at a cost. Oh, I meant to say there's a template there in the NAPRA document that you can fill in if you're making your own policies and procedures.
So James, this is quite a bit of work, doing your own policy and procedure, booklet manual on compounding. So maybe around the relationship, like Mediska, PCCA, companies like that, do what they supply, is that enough? Is their documentation around policies and procedures that you would have in your pharmacy to satisfy these requirements, is it enough?
Good question, Dean. So they have a massive list of various policies and procedures. It would cover pretty much every element of compounding. However, when you do access those materials, I would say they may require some customization to make sure that they do meet the unique characteristics of your compounding pharmacy, because compounding is not one policy fits all, but I'm sure they'd be a great starting point.
Okay.
So master formulations is, I think, one element that does cause some anxiety for compounding pharmacies. In the guidelines, it says they have to be developed by a professional, so that is either a pharmacist or a regulated technician, can have a role in developing master formulas, and they have to have adequate experience and knowledge. So I think in most cases that would include taking compounding training, and there's, again, courses available through organizations such as Mediska. Now, and also PCCA would have their courses too. So formulas, we mentioned earlier, are available from a number of resources. Mediska, PCCA, they offer formulas. And at the end, I'm going to show you a few, I'm going to show you a few different recipes, where to find those different recipes that are open source. So there are quite a few good resources that we can rely on, I think, and that are being updated regularly. And at the bottom, I hyperlinked a couple good templates for those of you that are going to be building your own formulation records. The one on the screen is the NAPRA template, but the Alberta College also has a nice template which you can work with. Some pharmacies are going digital with their master formulations. So there are elements in Kroll and Philware where you can build out your recipes. So for example, on Kroll, if you see under the instructions tab, there is a field there where you can type out. I would think you need the headers and make sure all of the information is there, but it is feasible to go and make your formulas electronic in your database. And under Philware, there's room under preparation method, and these will print when you're making your mixtures to follow along. Beyond use dates is another hot topic for compounding pharmacy. Now, I think it helps to look at examples. So what is a non-aqueous formulation? Well, an example of that would be adding a powder into petrolatum or a Vaseline. What is a water-containing oral? Well, that would be crushing tablets and making a suspension. So NAPRA gives us recommendations on beyond use dates to assign. You also have to look at the expiry dates of those individual ingredients because your beyond use date cannot extend beyond those. And lastly, a water-containing topical, dermal, mucosal liquid, or semi-solid, that would be adding powder to a cream or mixing a couple creams together. So creams are considered water-containing and ointments are considered non-aqueous. Quality assurance program, it's under the responsibilities of the compounding supervisor. And all of us, as part of step 2, stage 2 of the implementation, we have to ensure that we've set out a clear definition, application, verification of all these activities that fall under ensuring quality of the final product and the protection of the compounding staff. So some examples that would fall under a quality assurance program involve making sure equipment that is certified and has to be routinely checked, that there's a schedule in place. So for example, some of our containment devices or hoods need to be checked every 6 months. So you want to make sure that those schedules are in place. Quality assurance involves regular checking that if you have compounding supplies in refrigerators or freezers, that temperature logs are being checked, or even your compounded products that are waiting for pickup, if they're in a refrigerator, that has to be temperature checked as well. Ensuring that you're logging your personnel training, certifications, and reassessments. Monitoring compliance to your policies and procedures, so documenting when you're assessing that. And then also, all this documentation has to be retained. In addition, don't forget, if there was ever a quality assurance concern, that the action plan to address that is also documented and retained. And this quality assurance slide is just a brief overview. Please do read the guidance document because it's much more in-depth. So getting to phase 3, which is facilities and equipment, and might involve your largest capital expense if you're planning to do some of those more hazardous compounds, level B or C. So starting with your compounding area, whether for all levels, there's certain requirements. So it has to be a separate space, apart from your regular workflow, away from traffic areas of the pharmacy. It has to be large enough that you have enough room for all of the equipment required to be placed out in an orderly way, but also the products you're compounding with, you have room for those, and also to physically make the product. Look in your pharmacy when you're selecting your spot. If there's an air vent overhead, that's not an ideal location because air vents might be blowing out dust or particles that could contaminate your mixtures. So if possible, move the vent or move your designated area away from the vent. The surface you're compounding on, it should be a smooth surface that you can clean easily and that is non-porous, impervious to chemicals, so that you can clean it easily so that your compounds won't be contaminated. We're required to have clean water supply in the pharmacy, and that includes hot water and cold water. And there should be adequate light so that you can prepare the compounds, and also temperature controlled so that your materials are not at risk of breaking down, like if it's too hot in the pharmacy.
James, I have a question about this. So we require a water supply for accreditation of a pharmacy. So this doesn't mean an additional water source in this designated compounding area, does it?
Very good question. So if you have a level A designated compounding space in your pharmacy, you do not need to put another sink in your pharmacy as long as you have the hot and cold clean water available not too far from the compounding area. However, if you are building out like a compounding room, you are required to have the water source in that room as well. So you might need to add a sink. And lastly, you have to make sure your compounding area is maintained with cleanliness. So looking at level B and level C facilities, I explained this earlier. Level B, you have a couple of arrangements you can have. So you can have a well-ventilated, closed-off room with or without a containment hood, or you can have a room that's not completely closed off with a containment device. So in the slide there, you see an example from Millcroft Pharmacy in Burlington, one of our whole health pharmacies, and they have a level B room. They have the containment hood there, and it's that you can't see in the picture, but it's not completely closed off. So they do meet level B requirements, but not level C. So level C, you have to have a room completely closed off. It has to be have a ventilated containment device where it's blowing the air to the outside of the building through HEPA filtration. So that sort of setup requires the most capital investment. and you have to ensure that the pressure of the room is negative 2.5 to the dispensary, and then also you need to have the ventilated containment device, and that room has to have at least 12 air changes per hour. Addressing personal protective equipment. So there are different requirements for non-hazardous and hazardous compounding in the guidelines. I hyperlinked at the bottom there an article to the Ontario College of Pharmacists that they prepared about PPE, which I think is a good overview. So it would be worthwhile to look into that one as well. But basically, we wear this equipment to protect our bodies from hazardous products entering through our skin or mouth, or by accidentally injecting or inhaling chemicals. So for non-hazardous compounds, we always need to wear powder-free gloves, and it's suggested nitrile gloves because they find vinyl sometimes is more porous. You need to have a clean lab coat for level A kept in the compounding area, or a disposable gown. And you need to have, if needed, depending on your risk assessment, a mask like an N95, or head and hair covers, eye protection such as goggles. For the hazardous, there's some more stringent requirements. So for example, you're to wear 2 pairs of chemotherapy gloves. You need to have a disposable, impermeable gown, so not reusable lab coat. And those need to be changed whenever they become dirty or between compounding cycles. You need to have respiratory protection. You can get some more heavy duty respirators, but in many cases an N95 or N100 is suitable if it's fitted. And you are required to have head or hair covers, shoe covers, sleeve covers as needed, and safety goggles or a face shield. Is there a question we should do? So I wanted to come up with just a few practical tips for pharmacists when they're choosing where to put their level A compounding space, and how to ensure compounds continue to happen in your pharmacy. Well, we need to set expectations with patients that this is something beyond a regular commercially available prescription. So if in your pharmacy you have a compounding schedule where you're doing those preparations off-peak time when it's less busy, patients need to be made aware of that this compound requires extra time in order to prepare it according to the standards. So I suggest, and it's suggested throughout the guidelines, to prepare compounds free of distraction. Well, many of our pharmacies are quite busy, so if possible, you want to prepare them during quiet times, whether that's, early in the morning, or if you have a large volume, you could even schedule time when the pharmacy is not even open to the public, if needed, to support your business of compounding. Away from the dispensing workflow, I've heard stories about pharmacies wanting to designate their compounding space right on their main dispensing counter. I think that's probably not a good idea, because that's a place where there's generally a lot of traffic, and the compounding should be an area that is free of interruption and where we can concentrate on that preparation. Some suggestions to servicing your patients. For example, if you are meeting level A requirements in your pharmacy, but that level B compound comes in, or that level C compound comes in, when you do your risk assessment, you decide, oh, I can't make this one here, but I want to help my patient not lose that patient. Well, I would suggest you learn in your vicinity which pharmacies are able to help with that, and start building those relationships now. And then also engage with banner partners. So for those of us in whole health, we have a number of pharmacies that are expert at compounding. So we'll be working at supporting those businesses and bringing us together in terms of supplying compounds for our patients at Whole Health. So we're coming to the end. I'm going to share some resources with you as promised. So these are my top open access references. So the three there towards the left, those are children's hospitals. So CHEO in Ottawa, IWK in Halifax, Sick Kids in Toronto. They all have open access formulas for a lot of, in particular, pediatric prescriptions. The Perigio, they're the people that make like Orabase, Ora Sweets for compounds, for suspending agents, simple syrups. They actually have not necessarily recipes, but beyond use dates published for different drugs in their bases. So that is something that you could include when you're doing your assessment of the compound, and you need to determine a beyond use date. Well, you might be able to find some extended dating if you check that out. And Michigan in particular has a unique initiative where they're trying to standardize statewide oral compounds for pediatrics. So they have this initiative open access website where you can find lots of different compounding formulas. I just wanted to direct you to the pages from Alberta College in Ontario, where you find they're hosting the various resources, and there's a direct link there to the NAPRA model standards. When you're looking at the model standards, there's two documents you need to look at. So there's first the standards, which is a shorter version, but then the guidance document really tells you the nitty-gritty about what those standards mean. So everyone involved in the compounding really should, and especially the supervisor, be very familiar with both of those documents. In particular, for those of us in Ontario, our college has several pages long gap analysis that you can work through and check the boxes and see, identify those opportunities in your business where you need to focus your energies in order to meet the requirements before the deadline of January 1. And I wanted to make you all aware that here at Whole Health, we have a lady called Shirley Savage, and she is primarily our home healthcare guru, but in the last several months, she's gotten a lot into sourcing preferred pricing on supplies. So we have a number of vendor arrangements for compounding supplies. Don't ask for masks right now, it's probably not the right time, but other supplies. And we also are beginning to source out like mixers and hoods and lots of different supplies needed for compounding.
So James, we have, before we wrap up here, we have one question. It's in regard to compound. So the example given here is it's LCD in an ointment base has a best use date of 6 months. Is that pretty standard?
Yeah, so I would agree, because it is a non-aqueous base that you're adding the LCD into. As long as the ingredients themselves don't have expiry dates before 6 months, I would say that's appropriate.
Okay. So James, just kind of a final thought. I mean, I think to answer our question of the evening, is compounding completely dead? I think the answer to that is no, it's not. But, and it's a big but, you know, if you are going to continue on and compound, and it's really going to depend on the degree of compounding, it's going to cause some, or you're going to have to look at, you know, certainly personal protective equipment, you know, a slight modification in your pharmacy to a designated area as a bare minimum, you know, and things like masks, gloves, hair covers, eye protection, disposable gowns, that sort of thing, and even the creation of a policy and procedures manual. So all of that stuff obviously requires some work, some expense. Is it dead? No, it's not dead. So I think, should you do it is probably the bigger question. So that's going to be an individual decision amongst everybody on to what degree you want to participate in this.
Yeah, should you do it is a really great question. And you might ask, who around me is going to do it for the business opportunity? Because you might even network with your peers and see, who in this region has the facilities. If there's nobody in your immediate trade area that's going to be investing in level B facilities, maybe that's something that you should consider for your business plan, so that patients can still access their compounds locally.
Good. So I'm gonna say last chance for questions here if anybody has anything. James has some final comments. Obviously we were broadcasting on Facebook. We've recorded this, I assume.
Yep, so this recording actually immediately will remain on Facebook. Within the next couple of days, it will be posted on Whole Health's YouTube, which I will also share to the Facebook and via email to all of our banner stores. So the recording will remain available indefinitely.
Perfect.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, so thanks everybody for tuning in. James, thanks. Great presentation. I know I learned a lot about compounding. It does have a future. That's sort of nice to hear. And it sort of dispels a lot of those misconceptions, I guess, that the thing's completely dead and it's a Herculean effort if I'm going to continue to compound. It's not Herculean. It does require some effort though.
That is very true. So compounding is not dead, but it's going to take some work to get there. And most of us can do level A. Unless you have a tiny little pharmacy and no room, we can keep doing level A. It's just going to take a little bit of work, well, a generous amount of work, and you can do it. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.